Hey, here we go. Now, I'm the reason why I'm doing this is that October is Family History Month. And nearly 40% of Americans claim at least one immigrant ancestor who came through Ellis Island. Now, Ellis Island wasn't the only port, but it took in the most immigrants between 1890 and 1954 when it closed. And I claim one ancestor from that, my great-grandmother Agnes. She came here in 1901. Her husband, Daniel, actually came here before and was processed through Castle Garden. And I think I want to give a little word about Castle Garden because that was run by the state and city of New York jointly, and philosophically, it was much more different in attitude than Ellis. They were more oriented towards assisting the immigrant to get into America and make the transition as smooth as possible. Ellis was more specific about what their procedures were, and that's because the federal government assumed control of all immigration to the United States, which they currently still do. But anyway, here we go. Basically, before 1890, it was pretty easy to get into this country. It wasn't until about 1880 that really started tightening up. The most notable thing in 1882 was the Chinese Exclusion Act, because so many Chinese were brought to work on the railroads. And if you go into state archives like Colorado or something where the railroad ran through, you'll find lots of materials on their website about these people, but Americans at the time considered them to be a threat. And so they were largely excluded. For instance, Chinese women could not come into the country at all. And so it was pretty much easier for Europeans. And like I said, we had so many things. Like this illustration here is the Pennsylvania Canal System, which actually starts at the Delaware River and goes pretty much all the way across the state. And they needed men to dig these canals and to work the locks and the boats and everything. So that's basically what happened. But like I said, as we built up our population, we began to be a lot more picky over what we actually wanted to let into this country. And it was always controversial. It is very controversial today. We all know that. And no one can entirely agree how many people, what type of people we want in this country. So here we go. And that's what I'm getting to. What type of immigrant? And you know, by the standards of the 19th and early 20th centuries, they were very clear that they would rather have Northern rather than Southern European people coming into the country. I mean, even the Irish, who were absolutely despised. I've seen some cartoons from like 1847 or something that showed really horrific picture of drunken, loudish Irishmen, going and terrorizing people in eastern cities. But like I said, by the late 19th, early 20th century, they became a lot easier, more redeemable, I guess, in Anglo-American eyes. This picture was really good, and this was by a reformer named Lewis Hine, and he went to Ellis and he took a lot of pictures. And then the caption said, "This family looks a little worried because their luggage is missing. Because when you got to the island, you left your luggage on the first floor, and the reception hall where everybody was examined was one flight up, and we will get to that very shortly." Okay, there were all different kinds of records the immigrant had to fill out. And this one was actually generated for my great-grandmother, Agnes Casey, right here, number 65. And she was listed as a servant. And this was a list of people who were leaving the UK and not going back. So it was a very specialized list. And I'll tell you, it was extremely competitive between mostly Germany and Britain, as well as the British steamship companies themselves, to see how many people they could get across the Atlantic. And you could see how crowded this ship was. And it was something of a cash cow, and I'll tell you why. Basically, a ticket cost around $30, which is somewhat around $825 now. And larger ships, they could hold up to 2,000 immigrants on one voyage with 1,000 crew. And so basically ships like the Titanic, the Lusitania, I mean, people paid a lot of money to travel in first class. On the Titanic, to get a suite with your own private deck veranda cost something like $1,400 one way. And that was good, serious money back then. And basically, the real profit came from the immigrants. And a ship could make anywhere between $45,000 to $60,000 for one trip. And the cost to feed these people was roughly 60 cents a day, about $16 now. And but they also had costs too, because like a liner like the Cunard ship Mauritania used 572 tons of coal a day. I'm not saying pounds, tons. And they actually needed over 3,000 tons for one 6-day voyage. Now, in Agnes's case, she spent 9 days at sea, and that could be a real material thing for a lot of people, and we'll get to that a little later. But just to show you, this line, in 34 days, they had 6 scheduled sailings on these ships. I mean, it was like clockwork, bang, 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 get them across, load them up, and get them back over here. Now, this picture is actually sort of an idealized version of steerage. It depended on the line, depended on the ship. The older ships tended to be much worse than the newer ships. And basically, you know, families could stay together, but generally, if they were single, they were segregated by gender. Like the White Star Liner Titanic, one of the things that caused mass confusion when they hit the iceberg was that all the young single men were quartered in the bow and all the young single women were quartered in the stern. So a lot of the boys who had met some of the girls when running aft to try and find the girls and get them to a boat, and it was tough. And this is a typical steerage ticket. And like I said, about 1903, about $56. And, you know, like I said, it doesn't sound like much today, but most people then had to sell every single thing they owned. I mean, they had just enough to take hand baggage, maybe a trunk, to the train station to take them to a port like Southampton or Bremerhaven. And they, you know, sometimes they had relatives. Luckily, they had relatives in America who helped, but not always. And they just had to make do with what they had. And but the trip in steerage could be really, really serious depending on the ship, because at one time, the average mortality on a one-way crossing in some ships was up to 10%. And the steerage quarters were so crowded, so dark, so unsanitary. They were in the bow near the propellers, and pretty foul smelling. People couldn't bathe. Toilet facilities were rather rare, and actually some of America's earliest immigration laws had to do with the health of newly arrived immigrants. And basically, when a ship got to a place like New York, they would be in what they call the lower bay, which is near the mouth of the harbor between Brooklyn and Staten Island. And doctors would board, U.S. public health doctors, and they would check everybody, all the passengers, but first and second class were very cursory. They didn't look ill. They were pretty okay, and they were allowed to remain on the ship and dock at their companies, a dock like the Cunard docks were once at the corner end of 14th Street in New York, and but the immigrants themselves spent a lot more time. They actually were offloaded onto barges and transported to Ellis Island for the more rigorous inspection. And there was a little bit of, I guess, elitism, because it was assumed that if you could afford a first or second class passage, you couldn't possibly be dangerously ill. But they did actually have different classes. Class A was a loathsome or dangerous contagious disease, and Class D were conditions that would render an immigrant likely to become a public charge. And we'll come up with that a couple of times. Now, a subset of Class A would be mental conditions such as insanity, epilepsy, whole bunch of other stuff. And these are the barges I'm telling you about. I mean, as you can see, they could hold a lot of people, and sometimes they spent hours, literally hours, because so many people were being processed on the island, and they just simply had to wait their turn. Now, this was the infamous stairway. It was actually, like I said, when you got there, you left your luggage on the first floor. You had to climb these stairs to get to the central registry hall. And it was called the 6-second medical exam, because doctors would be at the top watching people walk up the stairs. And they were looking for any sign, any sort of weakness, heavy breathing, holding the heart, or someone who looked really sort of out of it, not really sort of being aware of the situation where they were. And so they would make a lot of, and these people would be pulled aside. And we'll get into that a little later. And this was the inspection hall. And now, as you see on the right, this is, it's been restored and looks very, very pretty. But on the left, you can see everyone herded into these steel, like for cattle, pens, and pushed around until they could get to all the tests and everything. And that was a real problem then, because some of the conditions in stairs were so bad and some people were in such shock that some of them needed immediate medical assistance as soon as they got to the island. And they said between 1890 and 1954, some 3,500 people died on Ellis Island. 1,400 children also died on Ellis Island, and 350 babies were born to citizenship there. And these are the inspectors. This is a group portrait. These are the men who literally had the power of life or death. They were civil servants. Many of them were native-born Americans. Some of them were not, which sometimes helped. And these are the codes that these inspectors used if they saw anything. And I'll show you some of the things. B stood for back, G for goiter, H for heart. And they would watch all these people as they passed by them, and they would mark symbols on their clothing. And this is what they used, a piece of chalk. And, you know, in a way, this was really, truly terrifying for these people, because they didn't understand the language. They were being herded around and pushed around, going from one spot to another. And all of a sudden, one of them has this mark put on them, and they had no idea what this mark meant, but I'm sure they suspected it wasn't something good. Now, there are a lot of reasons for an alien to be detained, and single women traveling alone often brought the greatest scrutiny, because this is where the public charge comes in. It was believed that single women who did not have a husband, did not have a male relative, would have a harder time finding and keeping a job. And if they had a job, they would probably be paid less, which apparently still seems to be with us. According to the Department of Labor, I think the average woman makes 79 cents for every dollar a man makes in the same job, but that's another story. Anyway, she was detained, and the record says she came care of Father Henry, who I believe facilitated the marriage, because Daniel, my great-grandfather, was already here. He actually came here in 1887, and this is 1901. And it says to be married to Daniel Marr. And they really did mean it, because they actually got married that very day as soon as she got off the island. And I have a New York City marriage certificate same day. I have the certificate from the church. They were actually married in a church right across the street from Battery Park, where she disembarked. So it was all done one day. And now, remember I said in the earlier record from the UK, she said she was a servant. That was sort of a code that women often describe themselves as a servant, because they thought it was thought at the time that a girl who would be a servant would be hired in some household, and that her wages would be supplemented by room and board, and she wouldn't have to pay rent. She wouldn't have to go and buy her own food. And so they were given more of a pass. So if you were smart, you said you were going to be a servant, even if you had no intention of becoming one. Now, this is also another familiar issue that we're facing: unaccompanied minors. And said that the Immigration Act of 1907 declared that children younger than 16 were not permitted to enter the country without parents. But it did not say that they had to be deported. Said children under 16 unaccompanied by either parent shall be held for special inquiry. That's what the statute said. Now, if they would do all sorts of things, like see if they could locate an American relative or someone that the child would know. And sometimes there were local orphanages that catered to dealing with immigrants who would sort of assume control of them and hope to adopt them out. Now, even children who were not unaccompanied, who did come with a parent, they had a problem too, because if they were rejected for any reason, the families had to make a decision on the spot which one of them would accompany the child back to their home country. So this could be a very serious issue. But now this is supposedly, we don't know for sure, a picture of Annie Moore with her brothers. She was the first person to go into Ellis Island. We've all heard the story. And but she was supposed to be unaccompanied. And it's a really interesting story, because when they were restoring the statue in the 1980s, Statue of Liberty, they were trying to find Annie Moore's descendants. And they believed they had found a Midwestern family who claimed descent from her. But professional genealogist, Megan Smolniak, actually found the truth that they were not related to Annie Moore whatsoever, and that the real Annie never lived more than a mile away from where she got off Ellis Island. She lived mostly in rental places on the Lower East Side, and she died in 1924. And in the medical exam, the inspectors were looking for anything that looked wrong. Like I said, labored breathing, head lice, anything that looked like a sore, a rash, a fever. And one public health doctor described his time as the best school for physical diagnosis in the world. And to facilitate the process, some of these immigrants, they had spent 6 to 10 or more days without bathing, and they had to be bathed in disinfected water before they could actually do the exam. And this is a big part of a nose and throat exam. So anything sneezy, runny noses, sore throats, everything, swollen tongues, everything would be checked. And you see the doctor, looking down this young boy's mouth while the others wait. And this is the dreaded eye exam. And this is what they actually used. This is what ladies actually used to fasten the eye holes onto a high button shoe. And you see the inspector, he's lifting it up. And this is supposed to look for trachoma, which at the time was considered to be a contagious disease. However, in the entire history of Ellis Island, there's absolutely no record of any inspector who inspected up to 2,000 people a day ever contracting this at all. So basically, and they checked heart and lungs, and the men had to disrobe and have them checked. And I love this picture because the inspector, the look he's giving the photographer is like, hey, what's the matter, you? And now women were examined by female nurses, and they could just lower their blouse just enough. And they had to go through this whole process. And if you failed the health exam, they gave you a chance to stay for a while. And they actually had a hospital on the grounds, which is still there. Actually, in the long run, plans are being made, hopefully budget-wise, to actually restore this building, because that's on the part of the island that's closed to the public. But in the future, that's what they hope to do. And basically, it was a really big deal because they wanted to give the immigrant a chance to get well to stay, but if they didn't, they would have to be sent back at the shipping company's expense. And so basically, the available info says only 2% of prospective entrants to the US failed the inspections and had to be sent back home. And this was not always a very good thing because most of these people, the reason why they were coming here was they were trying to escape something. At the time, one of the big issues were Russian Jews who were suffering from state-sponsored pogroms. If you remember Fiddler on the Roof, that's how Teddy and his family had to leave. It just got too untenable to stay. And this is an issue also still with us because many asylum seekers on the southern border from Central America claim that if they get sent home, they will be killed. Now, part of the health exam was actually looking for signs of mental illness, and one of the categories was feeble-minded. Like I said, being out of it, not really being aware of your surroundings, stuff like that. And so this was invented by a doctor called Howard Knox, and it was supposed to help the officials who were struggling to administer IQ tests to immigrants because of issues with language and literacy. And So basically, if they could fit everything together to make that, they passed. But like I said, you had to do it right the first time. And literacy, there were all sorts of things that they had to do to prove they were literate enough to enter the United States. And this was from the Getty collection. And it's called the Americanese Wall, as Congressman Burnett would build it. So he apparently was an immigrant hawk. And it said that Uncle Sam says, "You're welcome in if you can climb it." And you see these ink pens and these books on top of the wall. And usually most of these people who were 16 or older had to read a 40-word passage, usually biblical, in their native language. So if they could do that, they were good. Now, there are also trick questions, and we're going to go into some of these, and that's where it was really useful to have someone who had come over before, because, and I'm sure they're still doing it today, telling you things that you should or should not do, things you should or should not say. And now here we go back to the public charge dilemma. One of the most important things you had to have was money, and they didn't care whether it was, you know, your country of origin's money, because they had a money exchange, but you did have to have something. And you know, basically you had to have, my great-grandmother had $20 on her, which was, in those days, was enough to support her so she wouldn't be a public charge. Actually, the average American made about maybe $500, anywhere from like $200 to $500 then a year. So it was reasonable. And these are some of the other questions I had to answer. They want to know what your final destination in America. They were very curious who paid for your passage, which Agnes had to answer. She said it was paid for by her cousin. And these were very strange ones. In 1901, when Agnes came, the question on the form was, "Are you a polygamist?" And here is a Mormon with his, you know, multiple family. And I really, this is just a theory of mine, but one of the conditions Utah had to meet in order to become part of the Union in 1896 was to renounce polygamy. Didn't quite stop it, it still exists in some form or other, but they had to do that. And I mean, most Americans disapproved of it. One of the reasons why the Mormons were so persecuted in the East and why they went out to Utah in the first place was because a lot of Americans took violent exception to that custom. And 3 years later, her sister Lizzie was asked, "Are you an anarchist?" And I think I'm a little firmer ground on this, because basically I think since President McKinley had been mortally wounded by an anarchist named Leon Solgas in 1901, that was a real palpable fear, because basically anarchism didn't believe in government, didn't believe in things like politicians. They thought that everyone could just sort of discuss everything and work it out and make things fairer for everybody. So it was a very utopian ideal. And it was a very long process between, you know, waiting several hours on the barge, waiting to get to all the tests and everything. And this is a photograph by Lewis Hine of a young, well, it says Slovak girl, you know, a weary young woman resting against her luggage, waiting for what comes next. And there was a lot of discussion in the newspapers. In fact, actually, there was a newspaper that on one hand called the Police Gazette, and it was a real National Enquirer type publication. They published things of, with chorus girls and boxers and horse racing and all that things that were considered illicit. However, one of the things they did stick up for was the immigrant, about the bad conditions on the immigrant ships. And so this is from Harper's Weekly that said that the voyager in the steerage finds its course strewn thick with obstacles, and it goes on to describe how there are multiple questions asked by multiple different inspectors in this bewildering array that could, literally dash their hopes of entering America. Now, some people could actually stay on the island. There were some delays in the process. Most everyone got through roughly between 3 and 5 hours, all the things that they had to do, but sometimes they had to wait, and most of the time it's for American relatives could be located or they were still en route to meet them, because to get from someplace like Idaho to the coast, you're talking about a good 4 days. And it may be even longer. Now, they also fed them, and what they had at the time was simple menus that were meant to Americanize the immigrant, and usually they were pretty cheap. They had like a 22-cent meal and a 17% meal with a cheaper cut of meat. So, and so this menu from the 20s, they had mock turtle soup, ragu of mutton, vegetables, boiled potatoes, and Liberty pudding. I have no idea what Liberty pudding was. One thing that was really rather important was milk served to all women and children. So they believed that, milk had to be a very important part of the diet. And it's in these meals that the immigrant was exposed to totally American things that they had never seen before. One of them was ice cream, another was bananas. And I know New York doesn't have bananas, but they imported a lot of them. In fact, there were docks once on the east side on the East River known as the banana docks. So they must have had a lot of them coming in. Here's the polar bear in the room. Was my immigrant ancestors' name changed at Ellis Island? That is a persistent myth. I have read dozens of articles from professional genealogists. And basically, when you bought your ticket from the shipping company, Cunard, White Star, North German Lloyd, whatever, you gave the shipping company the initial information, and they shared that with American immigration inspectors. So basically anything that got changed was basically the immigrant himself. Some immigrants actually wound up changing their names before they got here. Most of them changed their name after they got here to be more American. And so one of the more interesting stories about a name change was in 1908, they inspected a man named Frank Woodhull, and they discovered in the medical test that Frank was actually a woman. And she admitted that her name was Mary Johnson. She admitted that she had lived as a man for 13 years. And the inspectors did permit her to be entered into the country. However, they changed the name from Frank Woodhull to Mary Johnson. So the records indicate that Mary Johnson, no matter what her attire or how she comported herself, was a woman. And one of the things that helped the process, because, one of the persistent myths is that, well, these inspectors only spoke English, and when you said your name, they wrote down whatever they thought it should be. And that's really not true, because a lot of these inspectors were once immigrants themselves. They were bilingual. They also had volunteers who came in every single day. I mean, groups like the Knights of Columbus for the Italians, the Hebrew Aid Society for the Jews. There were, dozens of people to help with the language barrier. So, like I said, if somebody tells you that their great-great-grandfather's name was changed at Ellis Island, it wasn't. Now, like I said, an estimated 2% or 120,000 people were not considered not worthy to enter the US, but there were some variations. And this is a picture of the DiCarlo family. And the DiCarlos actually were in the United States and in West Virginia, and Mr. DiCarlo got killed in a mining accident, widowing his wife and making orphans of his children. Now, Mrs. DiCarlo took voluntary repatriation back to Italy in 1907 from the mining company. They paid to send them back, but the following year, she came back again with the children, and they were taken in by a company, basically a charity that had sort of an orphanage in, well, it's funny, the source said Greenwich Village, but it's actually a little further south of Greenwich Village, but only someone like me, a native New Yorker, would know that. And they sort of stayed there because the big stumbling block was that she claimed that several of the children were born in the United States. And so they actually had to verify that. And one of the ways they verified it was that, when they counted the months between the birth and when Mr. DiCarlo died, they found that, yes, the child had to have been born in America, because this was a real problem, because a lot of places were still not filing birth and death certificates. So it was a little hard for some people to prove they were actually born here. And it still is an issue in like the last 25 or 30 years. There were a lot of Mexican Americans who were born here, but they were born in like the 30s, 40s, maybe early 50s, and they were generally delivered by local midwives who told the parents that they would file it in the county courthouse, the birth, but they didn't. So, and these poor people who had been living their whole lives in the United States and thought they were American citizens, when they had to go try and get something like a passport or something, that was a real problem. All of a sudden, or security clearance, they had no real birth certificate. And the State Department has been struggling with this ever since. And they also kept records of the people coming through. And a lot of people, they came through in actual native dress. This is a woman from the Netherlands, and these are 3 men from Russia. So anyway, we passed, and there were a lot of pitfalls. One of the things I didn't really discuss was there was something called the Alien Contract Law from 1885, also known as the Foran Act. And that was sort of important because they would ask you if you had a job, had contracted for a job in the United States, and you dare not say yes, even if it was true, because a lot of these people, they had a relative, a cousin, a brother who actually had a job lined up that as soon as they showed up, they could start to work. But they were worried about people coming into the country who were being bought over on a contract for a job, but turned out that there was no job, or they were going to do something a lot different than they were expecting. And so basically, you had to say no. You had to be really, really careful. That's where the immigrant network was in full swing. But once you got through the ordeal, the physical exams, the mental exam, the interrogations, everything over, you had to start getting yourself ready to get out of there. And one of the things you had to do was collect your baggage. And now remember, it was on the first flight, so everybody had to do this mad scramble down to try and find their luggage. And this is your prize monopoly, or in monopoly terms, your get out of jail card. This allowed you to get into the United States. So there were all sorts of variations on this, but that was it. And you also had to change your money if you hadn't already done that. And these lucky people, they are waiting for the ferry. And like I said, this is the building you can see today. That's not the original building. If you remember the picture who's supposedly of Annie Moore, that was the original Ellis Island, which was built of iron and wood, and that burned down. And so the building you see today was actually built to replace it. And if you get a chance, you really, really should go and see it, because this is one of the things you can see. This is a restored dormitory room, and see the sinks, see the basic bedding. And like I said before, eventually they are going to restore the hospital. And actually now they actually give hard hat tours. So if you don't mind roughing it a bit, if you go up to New York, you wear a hard hat, get on your construction boots, and they take you to a part that's still not open to the public yet. And that's the end. Here's some prospective immigrants. They passed it, they got their luggage, they're viewing Manhattan while waiting for the ferry to take them over there and to start their new lives in America. So thank you. I am open to any questions that you may have.
Great presentation, Tom. Right now, I do know that everybody is muted at this point. If you want to ask Tom a question, just press your space bar, continue to hold it down, then you can make your question. And then when you release your space bar, you will be unmuted at this time. Anybody have any questions for Tom today?
Tom, what's the best way to find a relative who came through Ellis Island?
Okay, I'm glad you asked that, because they actually have their own website. It's called ellisisland.org. And all the records have been digitized, and it comes in two parts. And this is really important, because they have sort of like a ceremonial certificate that has the immigrant's name, the date, and it looks pretty. It's suitable for framing. You know, you could print it off from there, but you could also order it if you want something a little bit like on cardstock. The thing is that they also have the digitized passenger list, and that's where you really should go into that, because they'll give you further information. Like, for instance, it's on the original passenger list that lists Agnes as a servant, that lists that she had $20. So it gives you a much fuller picture, but that's the first place to start. Ancestry will have a lot of things. FamilySearch.org will have things. So, but I would go to Ellis Island first. And if you have someone in your family who came before Ellis Island opened in 1892, I would try Castle Garden, because they go back to the 1820s.
And does that have a specific .com or .org?
Yeah,
Castle Garden?
Castle Garden is castlegarden.org. Ellis Island is ellisisland.org.
Thanks.
Okay, you're welcome. Yeah, hi, Santa.
Hey, Tom, I was a little late. I almost forgot,
No. And I always thought.
but I enjoyed your presentation.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Other than your relative's name to do the search, do you need any other identifying information such as date of birth or what country they may have been coming from?
Yeah, that would help because, like for instance, in Agnes's case, 17 Agnes Casey's came through Ellis Island, and only one of them is related to me.
Okay.
So the more you know, the better you'll be. And actually, the census can help you because various U.S. censuses, they ask your citizenship status. They asked how many years you were in the country, or what year you entered the country, and that should help.
Okay, thank you.
Tom, how long ago were you?
Hmm?
How long ago were you there?
Let's see. Last time I was there was 2017.
Okay.
Yeah, so I still have friends in New York, so every so often I was supposed to go back last year and that didn't work out, and we all know why.
Right.
I had theater tickets and everything. I got a refund though because the show didn't open until this year. Believe it. Broadway was closed.
Well, you'll have to go again now that Broadway's back.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, right now we just got back from Hawaii. We're actually in the process of going to Rome in the spring. So
Wow.
we'll see about New York a little later in the year.
All right, if there's no more
Thank you.
questions, I do want to just make a point of letting people know of the upcoming Tom Wilcox Presents series events that are going to be coming. On November 4th, Tom will be talking about the history of Thanksgiving. And on December 2nd, which is a brand new program for Tom, he's going to be talking about the attack on Pearl Harbor, specifically since this year is the 80th anniversary of the event. And on December 16th, it is one of our favorites, our White House Christmas. All three of those events are open right now for registration. So you can either look on our event calendar and register yourself, or you can easily call the library directly at 352-728-9790. Press option 3 when you're in our telephone tree, and we'll gladly help you register for those events.
Thank you.
Was there any last questions before we complete our session today? All right. I want to thank everybody for attending. We had a great presentation. Thank you very much to Tom, and thank you to everybody who attended today.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank
We'll
you.
link to our
Enjoyed it.
events momentarily.
Hey, bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.